Hello. Hello and welcome to your library at home. My name's Jade. I am part of the library's public programming team. I would like to begin by acknowledging that we meet today on country. I live and work on Gadigal land and take this opportunity to pay my respects to elders past, present, and especially emerging. I would also like to extend that respect to any Aboriginal Australians who are joining us today. Welcome to our latest Curator's Choice, where we will be hearing from Elise Edmonds. Elise is a senior curator at the library with a background in Australian history and museum studies. Elise has worked with the library's maps, pictures, and manuscript collections. For today's talk, Elise will discuss the pneumonic influenza pandemic, or in 1918, what was then known as the Spanish flu. Just a reminder that you can type in any questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and I will see you all again at the end of the talk. But for now, I would like to introduce to you Elise.
Hi, Jade. So I'm just going to share my screen. So I would like to acknowledge that this young institution I'm in at the moment, the State Library, sits upon ancient Gadigal lands. I would like to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and pay my respects to any Aboriginal people present today. I'm just going to, fix up my slides here. Hopefully you can see them. I'm going to start with a quote. Monday, June 24th, 1918. Oh dear, I feel nearly dead this morning. My head is splitting and I ache all over. Got some quinine today, but it didn't seem to do much good. Tuesday, went on parade this morning. There was a good muster and most of them were suffering from this rotten dog's disease. I was just 100 degrees. The doctor marked me for more quinine, but I haven't got much faith in it. It's all right as a preventative against cold or fever, but once you have the complaint, I don't think the quin does much good. So that was Arthur John Moore, who was an Australian stretcher bearer serving with the 8th Field Ambulance, serving on the Western Front in the middle of 1918. So some of the first Australians to come in contact with what was then being called the Spanish flu were servicemen and nurses. They were hit in the first wave of the pneumonic influenza virus that began sweeping through the trenches of the Western Front in the spring and early summer of 1918. There, of course, was a regular flow of people between the trenches and the staging areas to the towns and villages behind the lines in France and Belgium, through to the arrival of personnel in the UK for rest and recreation. Of course, all of that meant that there were many opportunities to spread the virus through the general population. Within the World War I collections that we have here at the library, there are vivid accounts of symptoms and treatment and the impact that this disease had on those serving. A young soldier from Tasmania who by mid-1918 had served 3.5 years in the AIF, wrote in his diary about seeing the doctor at the AIF headquarters on the Horse Ferry Road in London and being told immediately to report to the hospital. He writes, I was put to bed feeling about the worst I've ever felt in my life. Didn't care what happened. This was June 1918 during the first wave of the pandemic. He writes, passed another wretched night, no sleep, heavy sweats, bones aching, head splitting, and weak as a kitten. A pretty state of affairs, and my chest and throat are red raw, plenty of blood comes up. They say I have this dog's disease, Spanish flu, in a very bad form, and I believe them. This epidemic is raging throughout England and it attacks anyone and knocks you in a few minutes, it's that sudden. I've eaten nothing all day, only lay and squirmed in my bed with intense heat, and they don't seem to worry their heads in the slightest over anyone. She's the roughest joint I've ever seen. And as for Tucker, well, don't mention it. Nothing but salty kippers or rabbits. Makes me sick to look at them. It's a regular starvation hole for a sick man. So Archie Barwick had been sent to the Harefield Hospital in Middlesex. It was the #1 Australian auxiliary hospital. Harefield Park had been a private property owned by expat Australians prior to 1914, and at the beginning of the war they had offered their home to be used as a convalescence place for wounded AIF servicemen. And at its peak in 1918, the property accommodated some 1,000 patients, and by the end of the war, 50,000 injured or ill AIF personnel had been treated there. There's a cemetery also there called Anzac Corner, one of the many cemeteries, of course, where Australians were buried. Archie continues writing, the 29th of June, thank heaven, I feel a tiny bit better today, but my cough is still very bad, and at present I have very little interest in life. I know I would make a very bad patient if ever it should be my misfortune to have a long illness. Stopping in bed breaks my heart. And oh, the horrible and rotten medicines we have to swallow. Almost as soon drink poison. And on the 30th, a little better again today, but still have a headache and feel weak. It's spreading like wildfire all over this part of the world, according to the papers. So that was one Australian's perspective on suffering from the influenza virus. Another perspective is Sister Anne Donnell. She was a nurse from Adelaide who had already had a very eventful war. She initially treated the wounded from Gallipoli on the Greek island of Lemnos with the 3rd Australian General Hospital, and then went on to work in Cairo and then to the Western Front, where she served in hospitals and also in casualty clearing stations just behind the line. By 1918, she'd been posted to a hospital in the UK, and she was really suffering from exhaustion by this time. By mid-1918, she was actually working at Harefield House Hospital, which was the very place where Archie was being treated, and she was being run off her feet. She writes, several sisters are down with the flu. The well sisters are busier than ever. Matron says to do the most important work, give the treatment and keep the place as tidy as we can. Several sisters on duty are feeling sickly, but are still sticking it. Then she writes a few days later, the flu seems to be abating, but all the sisters look very, very tired indeed. And we have no one to take the place of those off duty, and I think there are 14. Then a couple of days later, she writes, this morning I missed Sister Dickinson's tired face at breakfast, and on making inquiries, someone said she was very ill through the night. On going over at 10 this morning, I hear the remark, my word, they've got the wind up properly over poor Sister Dickinson. Poor little sister, she passed peacefully on at 4:30 a.m. with her friend beside her. She really had died at her post, for she was on duty the day before. It's one of the saddest things that has happened yet, to think that she was in the midst of professional help, and yet so far. It must be heartbreaking for Matron. She has gone in today to bring the body out. We're so pleased that she is to be buried in the Anzac Corner with the boys here. It's such a peaceful spot by the side of the church. So this is what Anne wrote in the middle of June 1918. A few months later, in October, she picks up her diary and writes, my poor old diary, with the best of intentions, I haven't made an entry for ages and I've missed some many interesting things, but I really don't ever remember fighting so against time. Every day seems more than full. The long days on just fly. And for a fortnight, we've had very sick influenza patients in with the eye boys. It's a terrible flu, the worst I've come in contact with. It starts with an ordinary cold, and if neglected, some turn into general aching with severe pains in the back, in the small of the back and in the back of the head. Also great tenderness over the balls of the eyes. Temperature is usually between 103 and 105. Then almost without warning, an acute pneumonia sets in, which makes it hard to combat. We lost one of the dearest boys that way, and so suddenly, Sergeant Bradford from Murray Bridge. So Anne is writing in the middle of the second wave of the influenza pandemic, which swept through the UK and the rest of Europe in October and November 1918. It was the far more deadlier wave than that had hit in June. The Spanish flu had emerged from numerous locations almost simultaneously from an unknown source, although there are now theories that it may have originated in American military barracks, possibly in Kansas. But we definitely know that it didn't originate in Spain. The reason why it's associated with Spain is that during the war, Spain was a neutral country, and the news of this pandemic, of this influenza, was actually being reported in Spanish newspapers because there was no censorship in that country. And even, of course, the King of Spain suffered from the influenza at one point. It was a global pandemic. It spread through populations across Europe, the Americas, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. Approximately a quarter of the world's population suffered from the disease, and it's estimated that some 50 million people died, which was 3 times the number of soldiers and civilians who died over the 4 years of the war. The virus affected the respiratory system and was extremely lethal and quick. It was not uncommon for people to die within 48 hours of the first symptoms. And these symptoms consisted of a high temperature, aching joints, runny nose, cough, and general fatigue, which usually progressed to pneumonia. Once the lungs were impacted, prognosis was poor. The airways would fill with a watery fluid laced with blood and froth, and victims really struggled to breathe and would cough up bloody sputum that would turn the victims blue or plum coloured. And remember, Archie writes about coughing up blood in the hospital. So this coloration of the skin was known as cyanosis, which indicates that the patient's infected lungs were unable to transfer adequate amounts of oxygen to the bloodstream. So patients struggled to breathe. As one doctor wrote, patients were being asphyxiated in front of our eyes, and there was nothing that we could do about it. The pneumonic influenza was particularly virulent among adults in the prime of their lives. So people aged between 20 and 40, and it was more lethal. It tended to be more lethal in men than in women. And sadly, it was the armistice celebrations that were being held across the Allied countries, of course, the 11th of November, where the virus was spread silently amongst all of the cheering, singing, hugging and kissing crowds. Archie Barwick writes about the celebrations in England where he was stationed. He writes that everyone is kissing in the streets and no one seems ashamed of it. Procession after procession goes by, singing and beflagged, roaring its way towards the square and the pub. A piper comes past, followed by dancing crowds of young chaps with their girls. Boy Scouts are out in their glory. The restaurants are packed to the ceiling and hungry crowds wait outside. Aussies climb all over the horses and wave their flags like fury, shouting and yelling all the while. So reading all of these amazing, very uplifting accounts of the armistice celebrations, I think now, because, you know, having lived through COVID, we realise that this was, obviously these celebrations were super spreader events where the virus was being spread widely. Once the peace was declared, transport ships began bringing the men and women home from Europe to Australia in early 1919. However, the virus was still spreading. I've just got up on the screen a lovely example of a troop ship journal that tended to be kept by the people on board as they sailed home to Australia. The library has a great collection, and it was really just something to do to keep themselves occupied as they were on the ships. They're full of jokes and poetry and stories, many humorous drawings. And this is obviously the troop ship newspaper that was produced on board the troop ship D34, known as the Port Hacking. And obviously some wag has named the title of the newspaper the Port Hacking Cough. And so when you're thinking about the fact that the virus is spreading during this time and it particularly attacks the lungs, perhaps they are having a go actually at the influenza itself with the good old Port Hacking cough. So the war ends, the armistice is declared, and of course all the troops are being moved out, or the Australian troops are being moved out of the continent, and they are spending their last weeks in the UK, particularly in London. And their last weeks in London obviously are filled up with seeing the sights, attending theatres, seeing famous musicals, going to restaurants, and of course, many contracted and spread the virus during this time. One of the beautiful collections that we have here at the library are the personal papers belonging to Major Oliver Hogue, who was a Sydney man. He served in the 6th Light Horse Regiment at Gallipoli and then on with the Desert Mounted Corps. He survived 4 years of war and he arrived in England in early 1919, but was admitted to the 3rd London General Hospital with influenza on the 26th of February. You can see there on the right-hand side of the screen a handwritten letter that the doctor writes notifying Major Hogue's father in Mossman that Major Hogue was suffering from influenza and that he'd been hospitalised. And so sadly, Major Hogue dies on the 3rd of March 1919, and he was buried in the Australian military section of the Brookwood Cemetery in Surrey with full military honours. You can see there a photograph of Major Hogue early on in the war at Gallipoli, I think, in his tent. And then you can see the full military honours processing out to the Brookwood Cemetery, and the sort of order of service there as well, the day of his burial there. He was an interesting man. He had actually been a journalist prior to enlisting, and he worked as a journalist at the Sydney Morning Herald. He contributed a lot of articles to the Herald during his war service under the pen name Trooper Bluegum. And he also published a number of books, Love Letters of an Anzac and Trooper Bluegum at the Dardanelles. And then a final book, The Cameleers, was published the year that he died. And this whole collection has just come into the library in the last 5 years or so from a descendant of Major Hogue. So as the new year of 1919 opened, Australians in the Northern Hemisphere were being impacted by the pandemic, but the virus had not yet spread in Australia. The quarantine stations located along the coastlines of the various states had been able to keep the disease at bay and to prevent community transmission among the population. And of course, the quarantine station at North Head was particularly helpful in preventing influenza patients from transmitting the disease into the community. So the first ship that actually brought people suffering from influenza into Sydney was in October 1918. It was called the Niagara, and it was a mail steamer which was coming through from Vancouver, Hawaii, Fiji, New Zealand to Sydney, and there were 32 passengers on board who had the influenza. But it docked at the quarantine station, and those people served their quarantine 5 days, I believe. And there were numerous ships coming in after that time with people suffering from the influenza. And the quarantine station really did its job in making sure all of those people were isolated. There were a number of deaths during this time at the quarantine station of people suffering from the virus. And even while on the other side of the harbour, up in the city, people were celebrating the signing of the armistice, there were people dying of the influenza at quarantine station. Obviously, sometime in early 1919, the disease does arrive in Australia. It jumps quarantine somewhere. We just don't know where it did. But we know that New South Wales was not the first place where the influenza broke out of quarantine. It was actually soldiers who were travelling by train from Melbourne, and who brought the influenza into Sydney. A sick soldier reported after their arrival in Sydney, reported to the Randwick Military Hospital feeling unwell, and subsequently infected many of the medical staff at Randwick, and then the virus just spread sadly through the city. Within 3 days or so, the state government had closed all of the public places in Sydney, including libraries restaurants and theatres and so forth, everything was closed, and we can all relate to that now. And they were very quick acting. I've got up some newspaper articles from the Sydney Morning Herald from the time, making sure that everyone had to wear a mask. It was actually illegal not to wear masks. There were many warnings put out by the government. Police were keeping track of people who were evading the law, and smoking was no excuse. So people were being fined if they were not wearing their masks, if they were having a sneaky cigarette, and people were being fined, and no exemptions were being made. Early on in the pandemic, a lot of faith was placed in vaccinations, and Sydney-siders were queuing up to get vaccinations. However, they proved ineffectual. And likewise, there were inhalation units available in public places such as schools and department stores, which sprayed a zinc sulfate gas into your face and that you would inhale. But however, this remedy proved ineffectual as well. The Red Cross volunteers and medical staff were indispensable during the time of the first and second waves of the pandemic through Sydney and New South Wales. Temporary hospitals and relief depots were set up in public halls. School halls and Red Cross personnel went door to door in Sydney, checking to see who needed help. One way that the Red Cross knew that people needed help was that people were encouraged to put this SOS sign in their front window. We have a copy of this in the library's collection. It's like an A4 piece of cardboard, and you would put it in your front window if you needed assistance. It says on it, if you want any attention from the doctor, nurse or helper, put this card on the window bar showing SOS. There's a great photograph on the right there, which is from the State Records collection, which shows all of the motorcyclists who would carry the medical personnel, the Red Cross staff, and they would ride door to door through the suburbs of Sydney, making sure that if people needed help or not. There were two distinct waves of the pandemic in 1919 in Sydney and New South Wales. One in March, April, and then the other hitting in June, July. There were around 6,244 people who died in New South Wales, and nearly 4,000 of those lived in Sydney. And from Sydney, of course, the disease spread out along the roads and rail routes to almost every rural centre across the state. The mortality rate among Aboriginal people was particularly high, as high as 50% in some areas, although unfortunately records are scarce. So it's very hard to work out the exact numbers of Aboriginal people who were impacted by the influenza. Hospitalisations and deaths in New South Wales peaked in June 1919, and of course it's much later than the rest of the world because obviously due to our geography. Dying just at the peak of the second wave in early July was a 14-year-old, Keith Butler from Balmain. He was one of 432 children who died from the influenza virus. His mother and sister had also been sick, but they survived. And the library acquired just a few years ago this beautiful collection of little condolence cards, mourning cards and letters that were sent to the family from all over New South Wales. Obviously the family had lots of links to regional New South Wales. All of those little letters saying how terribly sorry they were to hear about the loss of dear Keith, and also reporting that the influenza was also raging in their towns. Also in our collection is this amazing photograph of the Peace Day celebrations. Peace Day was held across all the capital cities in Australia and all cities throughout the British Empire on the 19th of July 1919, celebrating the signing of the Peace Treaty and the official end of World War I. The building in the middle there is the State Library, the first wing of the State Library, the Mitchell Library. And so that's Macquarie Street, and it's looking up towards Hyde Park, and you can see everyone is out and about. There is certainly no social distancing happening, and when you look closely there are no masks to be seen. So I think by mid-July people were just sick of all of the regulations and the lockdowns, and they all got out and celebrated the peace. So I want to just quickly touch on it before we end. We have many of these items on display down in the library on the LG1 level, right near our Governor Murray Bashir reading room. You can come in and have a look at. That's up until January the 24th. We also have recent acquisitions we've made this year which document COVID. So it's a bit of a now and then display that we have up. So I just want to show you some amazing digital photographs we've acquired by some professional photographers who have documented New South Wales lockdown. This great collection by John Jansen Moore, who documented Sydney in April, May this year. Some really iconic images of a very quiet CBD with sort of lone commuters. A really amazing photograph on the bottom left of Bondi Beach in lockdown. With the Ruby Princess sitting offshore on the horizon. We've got photographs on the right of the first lot of international travellers arriving in Sydney and checking into the Intercontinental Hotel on Macquarie Street, and some builders, construction workers in Martin Place social distancing, because despite the lockdown, construction still goes on in Sydney. Also a fascinating set of photographs we've acquired from a photographer, Renee Nawitaga, who photographed Sydney Airport in May for Sydney Airport. She documented both the international and domestic terminals, and just really fascinating photographs of an abandoned airport. I love the photograph on the top left of all of the pilots standing around having a bit of a gossip and looking at their devices, probably having a chat about who's got jobs and who might lose them. A great photograph down the bottom of the domestic terminal with a woman walking up towards a Tiger Air banner, which I think no longer exists, Tiger Air. And just general images of these abandoned or semi-abandoned airport terminals. And finally, some regional photographs taken by photographer Dean Saffron of northern New South Wales and the border region. He photographed again in April, May, shops, retail areas in Byron Bay and Ballina and the Tweed area. So documenting health professionals working at the Tweed Hospital, the state border area, and some of the medical personnel and the kind of PPE they're wearing these days. And another item that we've acquired, which is also on display, is this beautiful visual art diary, a COVID diary, Corona diary by Australian artist Wendy Sharp. It's a very, very long piece of paper, which is concertinaed. It's like a little artist book. When you pull it out, it's over 5 metres long. That is also on display as part of our pandemic exhibition. And it shows her experiences and her thoughts about her quarantine dreams during the COVID lockdown. And finally, if you are interested in more information about the Spanish flu, we have produced a 5-episode podcast series called The Gatherings Order that you can listen to either on the State Library's website or on various podcast platforms. So that's the end of my formal talk. Sorry, I did go a bit over time, but I'm very happy to stay around in case people have questions. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen, and hopefully Jade will come back on.
Thanks so much, Elise. That was great. I'll get straight to the questions because we do have a few here, and another reminder to everyone, the Q&A box is at the bottom of the Zoom screen for any questions. So I'll start with this first one here, which is, what are the long-term cultural or medical impacts of the first pandemic? Can you see that impact influence on this current pandemic?
Wow, yeah, the long-term impacts of the influenza pandemic. When we worked on the podcast, we were really trying to nut that out to really work out what were the long-term impacts of the Spanish flu, because it really has disappeared from our collective memory. And we haven't really recorded it thoroughly, and it certainly hasn't been something that kind of reappears that we continue to look at as part of our history. And I think it was because it's sort of sandwiched between World War I and that whole story of returned servicemen and women, and then we sort of look then on towards the Roaring 20s and how Australia became part of the modern age. So it's really hard to work out how the influenza pandemic did impact us, apart from obviously it impacted many people's lives and it impacted families' lives, because they did lose many members of their families, and it's a much higher death rate than we are currently experiencing through COVID. One of the impacts is that the federal government decided then to create a health department, a federal health department. So up until then it was the state governments who were managing health and health services. So that's kind of an interesting concrete thing that came out of that period, was a federal Department of Health. Yeah, it's interesting to look at what were the long-term impacts. Yeah, it's hard to know.
Yeah. Sort of along the same thread, I guess, are there any obvious historical lessons we can take from the 1918 pandemic?
Well, it's amazing. We are certainly taking all of those steps that they took then to try and limit the spread. It's amazing, all of the same debates that they were having then, we have had this year. So it's amazing that even though we've come so far in terms of technology and medical understanding, just those simple efforts of wearing masks, of shutting down places of public gatherings, and of socially distancing and good hygiene, they remain the behaviours. So I think we certainly have learnt that is the way to prevent spread. Yeah.
Excellent. Someone has asked, are there any obscure parallels between the two pandemics that we are unaware of?
Obscure parallels. Oh, I don't know if there's any obscure things really. I guess it's every time, you look at an aspect of how they would, of some of the issues that were happening in 1919 here, it's like, well, that's exactly what we're talking about today. So there were border disputes, lots of border disputes, poor people travelling by train, trying to cross borders, and then facing, coming up to the Queensland border, everyone had to get out of the train and often were not permitted to get into Queensland. So it's the same debates that we're used to today.
Wow. Has anything changed?
No, I think that's the overriding thing to come out of this whole period is there is nothing new.
Anne has asked, what was the economic impact of the Spanish flu on New South Wales and Australia?
Yeah, so that was really one of the big questions we wanted to nut out in the podcast series. And in fact, in episode 5, we interview an economic historian, Simon Ville. And so he's still trying to come to an understanding of whether or not the influenza did dramatically impact the Australian economy. I think it's different to COVID this year because the Australian economy in 1918, 1919, 1920 was really dramatically hit by World War I. So Australia was in great debt and had to dig itself out of that debt, but that debt was overwhelmingly from World War I. So it is actually hard to directly correlate those.
Yeah. Julie has asked, when was the Spanish flu officially over? Was there ever a vaccination?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I was meaning to touch on that and I didn't. According to the histories that I've read and the experts I've talked to, they talk about the influenza fading away, which is really interesting. They never had a vaccine, but I think it was, it's interesting. I think it sort of mutated its way out. So my understanding is it got less and less virulent and it became more of a general influenza flu, that reoccurs in the population. So it's really interesting. I think at its most virulent, it was killing its hosts. So I suppose, it was incredibly virulent at that point, but it does sort of fade away as it continues to mutate. But I'm no epidemiologist.
Oh, interesting. Another question is, did anyone catch it more than once?
Oh, I haven't come across that. No, I don't know. From what I've read and the individuals I've read about, you got it and you either, you died from it or you did get better. And of course, lots of people caught it and then got better. There was no cases that I read who talked about getting it at the same time.
Yeah. And Anne has asked another question. My grandparents were in their late teens during the Spanish flu living in inner Sydney. They never talked about it. And no one at least caught the virus. Was this common?
Look, isn't that interesting? I think that's right about people not talking about it. And I don't know, I guess maybe if it didn't impact you or your immediate family, and you were able to keep working or continuing your life, it really wasn't a big thing for you. It certainly has not been, as I mentioned before, it certainly has not been a big feature of our histories, not just Australian histories, but globally. It's only, the medical historians who really have focused on it. So yeah, it's really interesting how it really has faded from our memory.
Yeah. And I'll make this a last one, and it's a personal one as well. Someone has said, "Wonderful, Elise, thank you. I'd be interested to know how have you and colleagues been personally affected in 2020 by the virus?"
Well, I don't, thankfully, I haven't been personally impacted by the virus, and I don't think many people here at work have been, so that's been a big blessing. But we've been able to work from home most of the time and coming in sometimes here at the library, which has been wonderful, and we're continuing all our work. So we curated the pandemic display all pretty much remotely. And technology being as it is now, just given us that huge flexibility to be able to work so much from home. And looking at the old Mitchell Library administration and filing from 1919, they talk about the fact that, all of these things were delayed and correspondence was delayed, all because so many staff were out sick. So we didn't have that this year at the library. I don't think anyone here has come down with it, and we've all really been able to continue our work.
Yeah, we're very fortunate, I think.
Yeah.
All right, thank you again. And please, everyone, as mentioned, if you get a chance, check out Pandemic, currently on display at the State Library. For more of our exhibitions and upcoming events, please go to the library website and visit our What's On page. Thank you, everyone, for your company today, and we will see you next time. Bye. Bye.